The 911 call came in at 3:47 p.m. on June 18, 2008, and it lasted 2 minutes and 11 seconds. For most of it, the dispatcher could barely get a straight sentence out of the caller. "My daughter, I can't find my daughter. She was right outside. She was right outside the gate." Diane Carter's voice on that recording doesn't sound panicked in the way panic sounds in movies. It sounds smaller than that. Controlled, almost, in the way people get when they're trying to hold a fact still long enough to say it out loud. She gives her name. She gives Emily's name, spells it twice. She gives the address of the estate on the tree-lined block off Sunset Boulevard where she'd been working since morning. When the dispatcher asks what Emily was wearing, there's a pause on the recording, 5 full seconds, before Diane answers. Because in that moment she realizes she has to picture her daughter to answer the question, and picturing her is the thing she can't yet do without her voice breaking. 27 minutes earlier, at 3:20, Emily had told a caterer's assistant she wanted to wait outside in the front garden. It was a warm afternoon. The estate was hosting a small charity reception. Nothing large, maybe 30 guests, string quartet in the back terrace, the kind of low-key benefit that neighborhood absorbed without much notice. Emily had spent the morning the way she usually did on days like this, sitting cross-legged near the kitchen entrance with a spiral notebook, sketching whatever was in front of her, that day according to the notebook later recovered from her mother's car. It was a half-finished drawing of the estate's koi pond. She was 9 years old. She was, by every account gathered afterward, an easy child to be around, quiet in groups, talkative one-on-one, the kind of kid household staff genuinely liked having around rather than merely tolerated. At 3:20, nobody thought twice about a 9-year-old asking to sit outside on a warm afternoon in a gated yard. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's not carelessness. It's the ordinary, reasonable judgment of a dozen adults on an ordinary afternoon. And it turned out to be wrong, in a way none of them could have anticipated. Officer Ray Delgado was 2 blocks away on a traffic stop when the call came through. He would tell a reporter, years later, that he remembers the exact turn he made onto the block because he almost didn't make it. Clipped the curb pulling in, something he says he still thinks about. He was the first officer on scene at 3:53 p.m., 6 minutes after the call. He found Diane Carter standing at the open gate, not moving, staring down the driveway as though Emily might simply reappear if she looked hard enough. She kept saying the same 4 words, Delgado said. She was right here. Over and over. I've done this job a long time. That's the sound that doesn't leave you. Within the hour, Beverly Hills PD had sealed the perimeter of the property. A watch commander made the call to request FBI notification before sundown, standard for a missing child under 12 with no immediate explanation, but rarely does it happen this fast. By 9 p.m., the estate's rear lawn had become a staging area. Portable lights on tripods, a K-9 unit's van backed up to the service gate, a growing cluster of neighbors in bathrobes and untied sneakers who had heard enough from the street to come stand at the edge of the property line, useless and unable to leave. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, thank you for joining Archive 26. This channel exists to reconstruct real investigative patterns through carefully researched narrative. And if that kind of work matters to you, we'd be glad to have you subscribe. Now, back to the night nobody on that block would forget. By midnight, search and rescue volunteers were working the canyon roads above the estate with flashlights, calling a name into the dark that nothing answered. What none of them knew, what nobody would know for 14 years, was that the single most important minute of the entire case had already happened hours earlier, in broad daylight, in full view of a man standing at the front gate. And that man had already decided in the space of about 60 seconds that he was never going to tell anyone what he saw. The events depicted in this story are a work of fiction, inspired by the patterns and procedures of real missing persons investigations. Any resemblance to actual individuals or cases is coincidental. This narrative is presented for entertainment and reflection. The forensic canvass began at first light on June 19th, and within about 6 hours, it had already told investigators the one thing they didn't want to hear. There was almost nothing to work with. Detective Sergeant Paul Okafor, who led the initial investigation before Richard Alvarez joined the task force a few weeks in, requested footage from every camera within a half-mile radius, traffic signals along Sunset, a handful of retailers on nearby Rodeo Drive, and the private security systems on the 6 closest estates. In 2008, residential systems at this price point still commonly ran on short recording cycles to manage storage costs, 48 to 72 hours before the footage overwrote itself automatically. 3 of the 4 cameras closest to the property in question had already cycled past the critical window by the time anyone thought to request them, less than 18 hours after Emily disappeared. The 4th camera, mounted on a decorative gate post 2 doors down, had been angled at a rose bed instead of the street for over a year. A maintenance oversight nobody had bothered to correct, because nobody had ever needed that camera before. I remember standing in that guy's driveway, Okafor said in a later interview, watching 11 months of nothing happen to a rose bush on a monitor, and thinking, that's it. That's the footage. That's what we get. There was no usable image of Emily Carter after 3:20 p.m. Not one frame, from any angle on any system in the neighborhood. Investigators turned to the household staff. 14 people had been on the property that afternoon, between the family's regular employees and the vendors brought in for the reception. Detectives worked through them over the following 2 days. 2 valets, a florist's assistant, 3 caterers, an events coordinator, and the estate's security contractor, Michael Harris, who had been asked to cover a daytime shift because of the event. Harris's interview, conducted by Okafor on the afternoon of June 19th, is on record. It runs 11 minutes, short for a case of this magnitude. Walk me through your afternoon, Okafor says on the recording. I was posted at the front mostly, Harris says. His voice on tape is level, unhurried. Checked in the caterers when they arrived. Kept an eye on the gate for the event. Did you see the girl, Emily, at any point after 3? A pause. I saw her earlier, in the morning, drawing by the kitchen door. I don't recall seeing her after that. Did you see her leave the property? No, sir, I did not. Anything unusual that afternoon? Any vehicle you didn't recognize? Anyone you had to turn away? Nothing that stands out. It was a busy day. A lot of vendors in and out for the event. Nothing that struck me as wrong. That was the whole of it. No detail to press on, no inconsistency to chase, nothing that opened a door. Detectives moved through the rest of the staff and got the same shape of answer, over and over. An ordinary, forgettable afternoon, nobody recalling anything that stood out. 14 witnesses, and not one usable lead among them. By the 3rd week, the FBI's involvement had generated over 400 tip line calls. A man in a gray sedan seen near the school. A woman who swore she'd seen Emily at a bus station in Fresno. A psychic who called the department directly 3 separate times. Every one of them was run down. Every one of them went nowhere. By October, the task force had been quietly reduced to a fraction of its original size. The file shifted into the long queue of active but unworked cases every major department carries. Not closed, never closed, just no longer moving. Carol Jennings had been a search and rescue volunteer for 6 years before she was called out for Emily Carter, and she says it's the only search she's never fully put down. She was assigned to a grid section on the second night, a stretch of brush and fire road above the estate, steep enough that her team worked in pairs with headlamps and trekking poles, calling Emily's name every 15 or 20 steps, and then stopping to listen, because a called name can cover sound that a response wouldn't. It was close to 2 a.m. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s, and Jennings remembers her hands going numb around the flashlight, remembers the specific useless anger of hoping for a sound and getting only the sound of her own boots on gravel. "You trained for this," she said years later, describing that night to a reporter researching the case's 10th anniversary. "You trained for the physical part, the terrain, the hours, staying hydrated, staying oriented. Nobody trains you for what it does to you when you're calling a 9-year-old's name into the dark for 6 hours straight and nothing calls back." Her dog handler that night was working a bloodhound named Scout, trained on scent articles, in this case, a pillowcase from Emily's bed, gathered from the family's apartment and double-bagged to preserve the scent. Scout picked up a trail near the estate's service gate and followed it roughly 90 yards along the property's rear fence line before losing it entirely at a stretch of paved access road. Consistent, investigators would later understand, with a scent trail that simply stops where a person gets into a vehicle. At the time, nobody had the context to read it that way. It read instead like a dead end, promising for 90 yards, and then nothing. Jennings's team came off the mountain a little after 5 a.m., as the sky was starting to gray at the edges. She remembers passing Diane Carter, who had refused to go home and was sitting on the tailgate of a command vehicle wrapped in a borrowed jacket, watching every team come back down the hillside and reading their faces before anyone said a word. "I couldn't look at her and say we found something," Jennings said, "so I didn't look away either. That felt like the only decent thing I could do, just not look away." The search continued in decreasing intensity for 11 days before it was formally scaled back to a reduced, longer-term operation. Volunteers like Jennings kept coming back on weekends for months after that, on their own time, walking grids nobody had assigned them, because stopping felt like a decision none of them were willing to make out loud. If you've ever volunteered for something like this, a search, a vigil, anything where hope had to survive without evidence, we'd like to hear what that was like for you in the comments below. Tom Reyes covered the story for a local Los Angeles station starting on the second day, and he stayed with it, on and off, for the better part of a decade. One of a handful of reporters who kept requesting updates long after the case had stopped being news. "The hardest part of covering something like this," Reyes said, "isn't the reporting. It's watching a neighborhood decide gradually, without ever saying so out loud, that the story is over. While the family it happened to doesn't get that option." He remembers the shift happening in stages. In the first week, the block was saturated. News vans, flyers stapled to every utility pole from Sunset to Santa Monica Boulevard, strangers organizing search parties on weekends. By the third month, the flyers had started to fade and curl at the edges, and nobody was replacing them. By the 1-year mark, when Reyes did an anniversary segment, he had to explain to a producer who Emily Carter even was. One of his most consistent sources over the years was Eleanor Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher who had lived 2 doors from the estate since the 1980s, and who had, in her words, watched that whole street's rhythm change after June 2008. You'd see gardeners, delivery trucks, all kinds of people coming and going on that block every single day, and nobody looked twice, Whitfield told Reyes for a 5-year retrospective piece. After Emily, everybody looked twice, for about a year maybe. Then people went back to not looking because that's what people do. It's not that they stopped caring. It's that you can't sustain that kind of attention forever. I think about that a lot. How ordinary the block looked again, so fast. Whitfield had been home on the afternoon of June 18th, though she told investigators at the time that she hadn't seen anything of note. She'd been in her back garden most of the afternoon, out of sight of the street. It's a detail that meant nothing in 2008 and would only matter, retroactively, 14 years later. Her property line ran along the same stretch of road where a white van would have had to pass to leave the estate's service entrance, and she simply hadn't been positioned to see it. "That's the part that still gets me," Whitfield said. "Not that I saw something and didn't understand it, that I was 30 feet away and saw nothing at all. There's no comfort in either version, but I think about which one I'd have preferred." Reyes's reporting over the years is part of what kept the case from disappearing entirely from public memory. Periodic retrospectives that Diane Carter would sometimes agree to, and sometimes couldn't bring herself to sit for. "She told me once," Reyes said, "that every article kept Emily's name alive for one more news cycle, and that mattered to her more than it cost her. I've thought about that a long time. Cold cases don't stay in the news. They stay in the people who live them, and they stay there differently, depending on what each person is carrying. For Diane Carter, June 18th became a fixed point on the calendar that reorganized everything around it. She left her housekeeping job within the year. She couldn't return to a neighborhood that, in her mind, still held her daughter somewhere just out of reach. She moved twice, first to a smaller apartment across town, then, in 2015, to a rental near her sister's place in the San Fernando Valley, close enough that she wouldn't have to spend every anniversary alone. Her sister Renata remembers June 18, 2015, the 7th anniversary, specifically, because it was the year Diane finally agreed to see a grief counselor, something she'd resisted for years on the grounds that grief counseling was for people whose loss had an ending. "She sat in my kitchen that morning," Renata said, "and she told me the things she couldn't say to anyone else. That some days she caught herself hoping Emily was still alive somewhere, and other days she caught herself hoping she wasn't. Because if she wasn't, at least the not knowing would finally stop. And then she'd hate herself for having that second thought at all. That's not a kind of grief anybody prepares you for. There's no name for it. You're mourning and searching at the same time for 14 years, and neither one lets you finish the other." Diane kept every flyer, every printed article, every business card from every detective who had briefly worked the file, however small their role. She called the tip line every June 18th, without fail, and by the 10th year, most of the calls were answered by people who had to look the case number up before they could tell her, gently, that there was nothing new. Michael Harris's 14 years moved differently, but no more easily. He stayed in private security, and by every account from co-workers over those years, he was a careful, courteous man, the kind who remembered names, who covered holiday shifts for younger guards with young families of their own. What none of them knew was that he thought about June 18, 2008, most days of his life, not because he had done anything to Emily Carter. He hadn't. His failure was smaller than that, and in his own mind, no less unforgivable. He had watched a van leave that property with something wrong about it, and he had said nothing, not that day, not in the 14 years after, because admitting what he'd seen meant admitting he had let it happen on his watch. His wife, Linda, married him in 2011, 3 years into a silence she didn't know existed. She would say, much later, that she always sensed something sat behind his eyes on certain days of the year, though he never told her what. Every June, he'd get quiet for about a week, she said. I used to think it was just his nature. Some men go quiet instead of talking. I didn't know there was a date attached to it until he told me himself, near the very end. Fear has a long half-life, His was still fully active 14 years later, right up until something changed that made keeping it quiet feel, for the first time, more dangerous than telling the truth. Would you have told the truth immediately, even knowing it might cost you your job? Or would 14 years of silence have felt, in the moment, like the safer choice? It's worth sitting with before we go further. In February 2022, Michael Harris went in for a persistent cough he'd been ignoring for months, the kind of symptom a 61-year-old man convinces himself is nothing until it stops being ignorable. The diagnosis, when it came 6 weeks later after a round of scans and a biopsy, was terminal, an advanced stage cancer that had already spread beyond the point of curative treatment. His oncologist gave him, realistically, somewhere under a year, possibly less. Linda remembers the drive home from that appointment more clearly than the appointment itself. The specific, surreal quiet of sitting next to someone in a car, while the world has just been rearranged and neither of you has found the first sentence yet. "He didn't cry," she said. "He just looked out the window the whole way home. And then, about 2 days later, he said something that didn't make sense to me at the time. He said, 'There's something I have to fix before I go.' I thought he meant paperwork, a will. I didn't understand until months later what he actually meant." People who are told they are dying describe the same thing again and again in different words. The ordinary furniture of a life, the job, the routines, the things that had always felt too risky to disturb, stops mattering all at once, and whatever's underneath gets very loud, very fast. For Michael, what was underneath was a 9-year-old girl's face he could still picture with total clarity, and a decision he'd made in under a minute, 14 years earlier, that he had never once stopped caring since. He didn't go to the police first. He was still afraid of that, even now. Afraid of what an official record might do to Linda, to the life they'd built. Afraid of being remembered, in his final months, as the man who could have stopped it and hadn't. Instead, over several weeks that spring, he tracked down the name of a detective who had worked the case in its earliest months and had since retired from the department, Richard Alvarez, who had left law enforcement in 2019 but, by his own account, had never fully left the file. "I get calls like that more than people would think," Alvarez said. "Somebody with a guilty conscience, usually about something small, a false statement, a missed detail. Most of them don't amount to anything." I almost didn't take the meeting seriously when Harris called. But something in Michael's voice on that first call, the specific worn-down steadiness of a man who has simply run out of reasons left to stay quiet, told Alvarez this one might be different. They agreed to meet the following week, away from any department building, at Michael's request. He wanted, he said, to say it once, to one person, before he decided whether he could say it to anyone else at all. They met on a Tuesday morning in April 2022, at a diner off the 101, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that's been on the burner too long. Alvarez got there early and picked a table in the back, out of habit more than anything. Michael was already thinner than the man Alvarez remembered from case photos taken years earlier. He sat down, ordered nothing, and for almost a full minute, said nothing either. "Take your time," Alvarez said. "I lied to you people," Michael said finally. Not about everything, about one thing. But it's the thing that mattered." He told it slowly, and more than once he stopped and had to start the sentence again. "There was a van," he said. "White, maintenance company. I don't remember the name off the top of my head anymore, but I'd know the logo if I saw it. It came to the service gate sometime after 3. Driver had a work order, irrigation inspection, something like that. We had contractors in and out of that property all the time. I checked his paperwork. It looked right. I waved him through. I didn't think about it again for maybe 10 minutes. What happened in those 10 minutes? Alvarez asked. Emily was in the back garden. I could see her from where I was posted on and off. I saw the driver talking to her at one point. Not for long. He stopped. I want to be clear. In the moment, it looked like nothing. It looked like a guy being friendly to a kid while he worked. I've replayed it in my head 10,000 times, and it never looks like anything worse than that, in the moment. And then the van left, maybe 10, 15 minutes after it arrived. I checked it out at the gate. The driver said he was done. I didn't inspect the back of it, there was no reason to. It drove off. I went back to watching the front. Sometime after that, I don't know exactly when, that's the part I've never been able to pin down. I noticed Emily wasn't in the garden anymore. I figured she'd gone back inside. It was a hot day. Made sense to me. When did you realize she hadn't? Michael's hands on the table had gone still. When her mother started screaming her name across the lawn. That's when I realized. He looked up. And in that second, I want you to understand, I'm not proud of this. I've had 14 years to not be proud of it. My first thought wasn't about Emily. My first thought was, I let a van onto this property and I don't have a record of who was driving it. And if anyone finds that out, I'm the reason this happened. That's the thought I had, before I even let myself think about her. So you didn't mention the van? I didn't mention the van. He said it flatly, like a fact he'd rehearsed saying for years without ever having to say it out loud. I told your detective I never saw her after the morning. That was a lie. I saw her. I saw the last thing that happened to her, and I decided protecting my job was worth more than telling anyone about it. And then, I had 14 years to live with that decision, and I want to be honest with you. For a long time, I told myself it wouldn't have mattered, that the van was nothing, that she'd wandered off some other way, that I was punishing myself for no reason. I don't believe that anymore. I stopped believing it a long time before the diagnosis. The diagnosis just took away my last excuse to keep believing it. Alvarez asked what he could still recall, 14 years on, and Michael gave him what he had. The general build of the driver, mid-30s to 40s, medium height, nothing distinctive in his memory except a company logo stitched onto the left side of a gray work shirt, an approximate window for the van's arrival and departure, bracketed to within about 20 minutes. And one more detail that hadn't seemed important in 2008 and now felt to Alvarez like the first real handhold the case had been given in over a decade. The driver hadn't looked like a man doing irrigation work. His hands, Michael said, were too clean. It wasn't much. It also wasn't nothing. And in a case with almost no physical evidence, wasn't nothing was more than anyone investigating Emily Carter's disappearance had been given in 14 years. Alvarez brought the new statement to Beverly Hills PD within days, and the department reopened the file jointly with the FBI's cold case unit, this time under Special Agent Sarah Kim, who had inherited the case's federal file 2 reassignments earlier and had read it closely enough to know exactly what had been missing. The original investigation wasn't sloppy, Kim said later. It was thorough, given what they had. The problem was never the work. The problem was that one witness held back the one detail that would have given the work something to attach to. Once we had the van, we finally had something to check against actual records instead of memory. The first step was mundane and slow, the way most real investigative breakthroughs are. A subpoena for the maintenance company's service logs from June 2008. It took the company's records department almost 3 weeks to locate archived files that old, and when they finally came back, the answer was immediate and unambiguous. The company had no record of dispatching any technician to that address on June 18, 2008. No invoice, no scheduled service call, nothing. The work order Michael Harris had been shown at the gate 14 years earlier had never existed in the company's system. It had been fabricated. That raised an obvious question. Fabricated by whom, and how convincingly enough to pass for real? Investigators pulled the company's full employment and payroll history going back to 2007, looking for anyone with the internal knowledge to replicate their paperwork and branding convincingly. It took another 2 weeks of cross-referencing termination records, old employee badge photos, and outdated uniform inventories before one name surfaced that fit. A technician terminated from the company in late 2007, several months before Emily's disappearance, following a workplace dispute. His personnel file noted that company-branded uniforms and a set of blank work order templates had never been returned after his termination. A loose end nobody had chased at the time because nobody had reason to. Before confirming anything further, the task force worked to rule out 3 other former employees who fit a looser version of the same profile. 2 were eliminated by verified alibis, travel and payroll records placing them elsewhere entirely on June 18th. A third, initially a strong candidate because of a prior minor offense, was cleared once his cell tower data placed him in a different county for the entire day. Kim later described this stretch as the part of the job nobody sees. 3 names that felt promising, and 3 dead ends, before we got to the one that wasn't. The name that remained was tied to a vehicle, a light-colored van registered in his name through 2009. And Kim's team pulled California toll records for that plate, covering the weeks surrounding June 18, 2008. The records placed the vehicle on a route consistent with travel toward the Beverly Hills area on the afternoon in question, and consistent with a return trip roughly 90 minutes later, heading in the general direction of a rural property registered, at the time, to his extended family. There was one more entry in his file that reframed the entire case. Years after Emily's disappearance, in 2015, that same individual had been arrested and convicted in Nevada for the attempted abduction of another child. A case investigators now recognized, reading the old files side by side with Emily's, as disturbingly similar in method, a fabricated pretext to approach the child, a vehicle staged nearby, an attempt to isolate the child from a caregiver in a matter of minutes. He was, as of 2022, still serving that sentence at a maximum security facility in Nevada. When that came back, Kim said, there was a moment in that office where nobody said anything for a while. 14 years, and it turned out the person we needed had already been sitting in a cell for 7 of them, for a different version of the exact same crime. With a named suspect and a location, investigators turned to the rural property he had lived on in 2008, inherited since by a relative and left largely undisturbed, a stretch of dry land with a single outbuilding and a tree line along its rear boundary. A ground-penetrating radar team worked the property over 3 days that August, moving in slow, methodical passes alongside 2 cadaver dogs. On the second afternoon, in a wooded section near the rear fence line, both dogs alerted independently within minutes of each other, and the radar returned a subsurface anomaly, consistent with disturbed earth at a depth typical of a concealed grave. Forensic excavation began the following morning. The dig took 4 days. Anthropologists on scene worked in careful, layered passes rather than digging directly down, preserving context that would matter later for both identification and prosecution. What they recovered over that week was skeletal remains, along with fragments of fabric consistent with clothing Diane Carter had described her daughter wearing that day. A pattern she recognized instantly and without hesitation when shown a photograph of the recovered fragment, months later, in a room with a victim advocate present. Several small personal items were also recovered from the surrounding soil, preserved by the dry climate far better than investigators had expected. DNA analysis, run against a reference sample provided by Diane Carter, confirmed within weeks what the investigators already suspected and what a mother had spent 14 years both dreading and, in some private corner of herself, refusing to fully believe. The remains were Emily Carter's. Diane was told in person at her home by Agent Kim and a victims services coordinator. She has said in the one interview she's given about that day that she doesn't remember most of what was said to her afterward, only that she asked to see the fabric photograph 3 separate times, as though repetition might change the answer, and that each time it didn't. With physical evidence now connecting the suspect's family property directly to the case, Kim's team, along with Beverly Hills detectives, traveled to the Nevada facility where he was already incarcerated. In a recorded interview room inside the prison, they laid out what they had: the DNA match, the toll records, the fabricated work order, and Michael Harris's statement, given under oath. He said very little. According to notes from the interview, he asked once whether Harris was the guard, and when told yes, he made no further comment on it. He did not confess. He offered no account of June 18, 2008, and no cooperation beyond a flat acknowledgement, late in the interview, that he wasn't going to pretend the evidence wasn't there. It was, investigators later said, the closest thing to an admission they were going to get, and given everything else, it was enough. Given the confirmed physical evidence, the reconstructed timeline, and the established pattern from the 2015 Nevada offense, prosecutors charged him in California. He was convicted the following year and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence to be served consecutively after the one he was already serving, ensuring he will never again be free in either state. Michael Harris did not live to see the trial. He died in late 2022, several months after giving his statement, with Linda beside him. He had asked her in his final weeks, for one thing, to be told, if the case ever moved forward, whether it had been enough. He did live to attend Emily's funeral, held that autumn once her remains were released to Diane Carter. He did not sit with the mourners. He stood at the edge of the gathering, near the cemetery's outer fence line, in a coat too heavy for the weather. When the service ended and the small crowd began to disperse, he walked forward alone, placed a single white flower on the casket, and stood there for perhaps 10 seconds without saying anything to anyone. A local reporter, Tom Reyes, who had covered the case from its second day, recognized him from an old case photo and approached, but Michael only shook his head once, gently, and walked back to his car. He never spoke to the press. He gave his only full account to Richard Alvarez at a diner months before he died, and to the investigators who used it to finally find her. Diane Carter, after 14 years without an answer, was finally able to bury her daughter. This story is a work of fiction, built from the recurring patterns of real missing persons cases and real investigative procedure, and created for entertainment and reflection, not as an account of actual events or actual people. Thank you for spending this time with us on Archive 26. If this case stayed with you, we'd genuinely like to know what you think in the comments. Which detail for you was the hardest to sit with? If you found this reconstruction worthwhile, a like helps more people find it. And if investigative stories like this one are what you come here for, we'd be glad to have you subscribe for the next case file.